Kong Wu sat in the darkest corner of the space station cantina, where nobody would bother him. The old chair creaked under his weight as he stared into his cup of fake coffee that tasted like metal and sadness. At 73 years old, he was older than most aliens in the galaxy, and they all looked at him like he was some kind of museum piece. The cantina was full of different alien species tonight. The tall blue Vilathi traders with their smooth skin and fancy clothes talked loudly about their latest deals. The crystal people called Nix sat quietly in the corner, making soft singing sounds that passed for conversation among their kind. All of them looked young and successful and important. Wu remembered when he was young too. Back when humans first started traveling to the stars, he was the smartest engineer anyone had ever seen. He could fix anything, build anything, make any machine work better than it was supposed to. His hands were steady then, and his mind was sharp, like a knife that could cut through any problem. Those days were long gone now. His hands shook when he held his coffee cup, and sometimes he forgot things that used to be easy to remember. The other humans on the station were much younger, and they all had fancy new tools and computers that could do things he never dreamed of. They called him old-fashioned and outdated, like a broken machine that nobody wanted anymore. The cantina lights flickered and went dim for a moment, making strange shadows dance on the walls. Wu had been coming here every night for 5 years now, ever since he retired from active duty. He told everyone he was retired, but the truth was nobody wanted to hire an old man when there were young people with new ideas and better training. He thought about the old days when he worked on the great ship called Harmony. It was humanity's first real starship that could travel between the stars, and he helped design every part of it: the engines that could bend space itself, the life support systems that kept people alive in the cold emptiness of space, the computers that could think faster than any human brain. But then came the accident, the one that killed his whole crew and left him alone, the one that made him wake up screaming in the middle of the night for years afterward, the one that made him question everything he thought he knew about engineering and safety, and whether he was really as smart as everyone said. The accident was his fault, he knew it, even though the official report said it was just bad luck, a tiny mistake in his calculations that he should have caught. A simple error that cost 47 lives, including his best friend and his own daughter, who had joined the crew to learn engineering from her father after that he stopped working on the big projects. He took smaller jobs, fixing air recyclers and water purifiers and food processors. Nothing that could hurt anyone if he made a mistake, nothing that mattered very much if he got too old and stupid to do it right. The aliens in the cantina never talked to him. They probably didn't even know he used to be famous back on Earth. They just saw an old human taking up space and drinking cheap coffee. The younger humans on the station sometimes said hello, but they were always in a hurry to get somewhere important, to work on something that would make them rich or famous. Wu didn't mind being ignored. He had gotten used to it over the years. Sometimes it was better to be forgotten than to be remembered for the wrong reasons. He sipped his coffee and watched the aliens through the dirty windows of the cantina. They all looked so confident and sure of themselves, like they knew exactly where they belonged in the universe. Of Vilathi were the worst. They acted like they invented space travel, even though everyone knew they just copied technology from older species. They wore expensive clothes and talked about how primitive human technology was compared to their advanced systems. They never missed a chance to remind everyone that humans were newcomers to the galaxy. The Nix were quieter, but just as arrogant. They communicated through vibrations in their crystal bodies that made beautiful music, but they never tried to include other species in their conversations. They thought they were better than everyone else because they lived for thousands of years and had perfect memories. Then there were the Korath, who thankfully rarely visited this part of space. They were warriors who had conquered half the galaxy with ships that could destroy planets. They had technology so advanced that most species couldn't even understand how it worked. They treated everyone else like children playing with toys. Wu finished his coffee and was about to get up and go back to his tiny apartment when he heard a loud noise outside. The whole station shook and the lights flickered again, but this time they stayed dim. People in the cantina started talking loudly and pointing at the windows. Through the dirty glass, Wu could see something that made his old heart beat faster. A massive ship was coming toward the station, but it wasn't flying straight. It was wobbling and spinning like a drunk person trying To walk home, the ship was trailing smoke and sparks, and its lights were flashing in patterns that meant emergency even from faraway Wu could see that it was a Korath ship, one of their big war vessels that usually looked perfect and deadly now. It looked like it had been in a terrible fight with something even stronger. The hull was cracked and blackened, and pieces were falling off as it struggled to reach the station. The other people in the cantina were getting excited. Some of them had never seen a Korath ship before, and they were taking pictures with their devices. Others looked scared because everyone knew that Korath ships carried weapons that could blow up the whole station if something went wrong. Wu felt something he hadn't felt in years, a tingle in his fingers and a quickening of his pulse that meant his old engineer instincts were waking up. He could tell just by looking at the ship that it was in serious trouble. The way it was moving meant the engines were failing, and the emergency lights meant life support was probably damaged too. The station commander, Park Hae, came running into the cantina looking worried. She was a young woman who had always been polite to Wu even when others ignored him. She started talking to the alien traders, asking if any of them knew anything about Korath technology. The Velothi shook their heads and said they never worked on military ships. The Nix just hummed sadly and said Korath technology was too dangerous for them to understand. The other aliens all had excuses about why they couldn't help. Wu stood up slowly, his joints protesting after sitting for so long. He walked over to where Commander Park was talking to the aliens. She looked up at him with surprise, like she had forgotten he was there. The old engineer looked out the window at the damaged ship and felt his mind starting to work the way it used to when he was young. He could see things that others missed, patterns in the damage that told a story about what had gone wrong. This was going to be interesting. The Korath delegation stomped into the cantina like they owned the whole galaxy. Captain Thul Moran was massive even by Korath standards, standing over 7 feet tall with scales that looked like polished green metal. His eyes glowed red in the dim light, and his teeth were sharp enough to cut through steel plate. Behind him came 4 Korath engineers, each one bigger and more intimidating than most humans. Their scaled skin was covered in scars from battles, and their hands ended in claws that could tear through armor. They wore uniforms that cost more than most people made in a year, and they carried devices that hummed with dangerous energy. Commander Park Hae stepped forward to greet them, but Captain Moran barely looked at her. He was scanning the cantina like he was looking for threats, or maybe just counting how many inferior beings were in his presence. The other aliens in the cantina had gone completely silent. Even the proud Velothi traders were staring at their drinks. The Korath had ruled the eastern part of the galaxy for over 300 years. Their ships could destroy entire fleets, and their technology was so advanced that most species couldn't even understand the basic principles. Other races feared them, respected them, and tried to stay out of their way. Captain Moran spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding metal mixed with thunder. His words were translated by a device on his belt, but even through the translator you could hear the anger and frustration. He needed repairs for his ship, and he needed them now. Commander Park tried to explain that the station had excellent repair facilities and skilled engineers from many different species, but Captain Moran just growled and said his ship used quantum phase engines that were beyond the understanding of primitive species. The Korath chief engineer stepped forward. Her name was Next Kala, and she was almost as tall as the captain. Her scales were silver instead of green, and her eyes were cold blue like frozen stars. She activated a holographic display that showed the inside of their ship. The hologram was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. It showed engines that seemed to be made of pure energy contained in crystalline chambers. The energy flowed through pathways that twisted and turned in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Everything was connected to everything else in ways that made no sense. Next Kala explained that their quantum matrix was failing. The matrix was the heart of their faster-than-light drive, and without it working properly, the ship would explode, taking half the station with it. They had maybe 6 hours before the cascade failure became unstoppable. Commander Park looked around the cantina at all the different species present. She asked if anyone had experience with quantum phase technology. The Velothi traders shook their heads quickly. The Nix made sad humming sounds that meant they were sorry but couldn't help. Then Commander Park did something that made everyone in the cantina gasp. She pointed at Kong Wu, who was still sitting in his corner drinking his coffee. She said that the old human engineer might be able to help. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the other side of the station. Then the Korath started making sounds that might have been laughter, but sounded more like metal being torn apart. Captain Moran looked at Wu like he was looking at a bug that had crawled out of his food. The idea was completely ridiculous. A primitive human who was old even by human standards trying to repair technology that the Korath themselves barely understood. Their own engineers had studied for decades just to learn how to operate their ships properly. Next, Kala walked over to Wu's table, moving like a predator stalking prey. She loomed over the old man, who continued sipping his coffee like nothing was happening. She started speaking in rapid Korath before remembering to use the translator. She told Wu that their quantum matrix operated on principles that humans had never even discovered. Their engines used exotic matter that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. The power output was measured in units that human mathematics couldn't even express. The other Korath engineers joined in the mockery. They said humans were barely out of caves when the Korath were building their first starships. Human technology was crude and unreliable compared to their advanced systems. A human trying to fix a Korath ship was like a child trying to perform surgery. But Wu just sat there listening to every word. His old eyes were studying the holographic display, and his weathered hands were tracing patterns in the air like he was following the energy flows. The other people in the cantina were watching him too, wondering if the old man had finally lost his mind. Captain Moran was getting impatient. His ship was dying, and every minute they wasted increased the chance of catastrophic failure. He wanted to know if there were any real engineers on the station, not ancient relics who had been forgotten by their own species commander. Park stood her ground. She reminded the captain that Kang Wu had been the chief engineer on humanity's first interstellar ship. He had designed fusion drives that could fold space and life support systems that kept crews alive for years in the void. The Korath found this even more amusing. Human fusion drives were primitive compared to their quantum phase engines. Human life support was basic chemistry, while their ships used exotic matter to create perfect environments. A human engineer from the early days of space travel was like a Stone Age toolmaker trying to build a computer. Next, Kala decided to have some fun with the old human. She enhanced the holographic display, showing more details of their engine systems. The quantum matrix was fracturing along stress lines that followed mathematical equations. Humans had never seen the cascade failure was spreading through their propulsion system like a virus. She explained that their own repair attempts had only made things worse. They had tried reinforcing the matrix with exotic materials, but the fractures kept spreading. Their most advanced diagnostic equipment couldn't even identify the root cause of the problem. The energy patterns were so complex that they required quantum computers to analyze, and even then the calculations took hours to complete. The repair procedures involved manipulating matter at the subatomic level while maintaining perfect synchronization across multiple dimensions. Wu finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. He stood up slowly, his joints making small cracking sounds that seemed very loud in the quiet cantina. Everyone was watching him now, wondering what the old man would do next. He walked over to the holographic display and stood there for a long moment, just looking at the swirling patterns of energy. The Korath engineers were smirking behind their translator devices, sure that the primitive human was completely lost. Then Wu did something that surprised everyone. He reached out and touched the hologram. His fingers moved through the light patterns, tracing the energy flows like he was reading a book written in a language only he understood. Captain Moran was about to say something dismissive when Wu spoke. His voice was quiet but clear, and every word carried the weight of decades of experience. He said he would look at their ship, but he had one condition: he would work alone. The Korath engineers would have to stay away from the engine room while he figured out what was wrong. Their presence would only distract him from finding the real problem. The demand was so outrageous that even the translator devices seemed to pause in confusion. A primitive human telling advanced Korath engineers to stay away from their own ship. It was like a mouse telling lions how to hunt, but time was running out, and Captain Moran was desperate enough to try anything. He agreed to let the old human look at their engines, but warned that if Wu made things worse, he would personally throw him out the nearest airlock. Wu nodded like he had expected. Nothing less, he asked Commander Park to show him to the docking bay where the Korath ship was waiting. The old engineer was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The Korath engine room was like stepping into the heart of a star. Everything glowed with different colors of light that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Crystalline conduits carried streams of energy that looked like liquid lightning, and the air itself hummed with power that made Wu's teeth ache. He had seen many engine rooms in his life, but nothing like this. The space was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above the quantum matrix dominated the center of the room, a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with its own inner light. The matrix was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like looking at the birth of a new universe. The Korath engineers followed him into the room but kept their distance. As promised, they stood near the entrance, whispering among themselves in their own language. Their translator devices were turned off, but Wu could tell from their body language that they were making jokes about the foolish old human. Wu ignored them completely. He walked slowly around the quantum matrix, studying it from every angle. His experienced eyes traced the energy pathways that flowed through the crystal structure like rivers of light. The matrix was cracked in several places, and the cracks were spreading slowly but steadily. He could see why the Korath engineers were having trouble. The technology was incredibly advanced, but it was also incredibly complex. Every component was connected to every other component in ways that created millions of potential failure points. The system was so sophisticated that it had become fragile. The old engineer knelt down beside one of the smaller conduits and placed his hand on the cool crystal surface. He could feel the vibrations running through the material like a heartbeat. Every machine had its own rhythm, and this one was sick. The vibrations were uneven and harsh instead of smooth and steady. The Korath had built something magnificent, but they had forgotten one of the most basic principles of engineering. The more complex a system became, the more ways it could break down. Simple systems were reliable because there were fewer things that could go wrong. Wu stood up and walked over to his toolkit. It was a small metal box that looked primitive compared to the gleaming Korath equipment, but it contained tools that had been passed down through generations of human engineers. Some of them were so old they had been made by hand in the early days of space travel. The Korath engineers watched with growing confusion as Wu pulled out instruments that looked like they belonged in a museum. His diagnostic tools were mechanical instead of electronic, and his measuring devices used principles that were centuries old, but Wu knew something the Korath had forgotten. Sometimes the oldest tools were the best ones. Electronic equipment could be fooled by electromagnetic interference and quantum effects, but a simple mechanical gauge would always tell the truth. He began taking measurements of the quantum matrix using methods that the Korath had never seen before. Instead of trying to analyze the complex quantum equations, he focused on the basic physical properties of the crystal structure. How much stress was it under? Where were the weak points? How was it responding to the energy flowing through it? The more he studied the matrix, the more he understood what was wrong. The Korath had built their engine to be perfect. Every component was precisely calibrated to work at maximum efficiency, but perfection was brittle. One small change in operating conditions could cause the whole system to fail. Hours passed as Will worked in silence. The Korath engineers grew bored and started leaving the room one by one. They had seen enough to convince themselves that the old human was wasting everyone's time. His primitive methods could never solve a problem that their advanced technology couldn't handle, but Wu was making progress. He had found the pattern in the failure. The cracks in the quantum matrix were following specific stress lines that radiated out from a central point. Something was causing harmonic vibrations that were slowly shaking the crystal structure apart. The source of the vibrations was tiny compared to the massive engine around it. A small resonance amplifier no bigger than his thumb that had been installed to improve efficiency by a fraction of a percent. The amplifier was working exactly as designed, but its harmonic frequency was slowly destroying the matrix. The Korath engineers had tried to fix the cracks by reinforcing them with stronger materials, but they had been treating the symptom instead of the disease. The resonance amplifier was still there, still vibrating, still spreading destruction through the crystal structure. Wu smiled. For the first time in years, he had found the problem, and he knew exactly how to fix it. The solution was so simple that the Korath would never have thought of it. They were too focused on complex solutions to see the simple answer that was right in front of them. He opened his toolkit and pulled out a small piece of metal that he had. Shaped by hand, it was just ordinary steel, nothing special about it. Except for the careful way it had been crafted, the metal had been polished to a mirror finish and shaped to very specific dimensions. The Korath engineers who had returned to watch the final stages of his work looked at the piece of steel with confusion. They could see that it was primitive human technology, but they couldn't understand why he thought it would help Wu. Carefully remove the resonance amplifier from the quantum matrix. The crystal structure immediately began to stabilize. As the harmful vibrations stopped, the cracks stopped spreading and the energy flows became smoother. Then he installed his piece of steel in place of the amplifier. The metal was designed to absorb vibrations instead of amplifying them. It would act like a shock absorber, protecting the delicate crystal structure from harmonic damage. The Korath engineers were horrified. They watched in disbelief as the old human replaced their precision quantum technology with a chunk of primitive metal. Their instruments showed that the steel shouldn't work, that it would disrupt the delicate quantum fields that powered their drive. But as Wu made the final connection, something amazing happened. The quantum matrix began to stabilize completely. The harsh vibrations that had been slowly destroying it were replaced by a smooth, steady rhythm. The energy flows became cleaner and more efficient than they had been in months. The old engineer stood back and wiped his hands on his coveralls. He looked at the Korath engineers, who were staring at their instruments in shock. Their readings showed that the engine was not only fixed, but actually running better than it had. When it was new, Wu picked up his tools and walked toward the door. His work was done, and he was ready to go back to his corner table in the cantina. But as he reached the entrance, he turned back for one last look at the quantum matrix. The beautiful crystal structure was glowing with steady light, no longer flickering or pulsing erratically. The energy flowed through it like water through a well-designed channel, smooth and efficient. The piece of simple human steel sat at the heart of the alien technology, looking completely out of place but working perfectly. The Korath engineers were still staring at their instruments, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Their most advanced technology had been saved by a piece of primitive metal shaped by an old man's hands. It challenged everything they thought they knew about engineering and the universe. Commander Park Hae arrived at the Korath ship to find chaos in the corridors. Alien crew members were running back and forth, checking systems and talking excitedly in their harsh language. The emergency lights had stopped flashing, and the smell of burning circuits was being replaced by the clean scent of properly functioning machinery. She found Wu sitting on a bench outside the engine room, looking tired but satisfied. His coveralls were stained with exotic coolants and his gray hair was sticking up in all directions, but his eyes were bright with the fire of accomplishment. The Korath engineers were huddled around their instruments, talking in rapid whispers that their translator devices were struggling to keep up with. They kept looking at the engine room door like they expected something impossible to come walking out. Captain Moran appeared in the corridor, moving with the deadly grace of a predator. His red eyes were fixed on Wu, and his expression was unreadable. The old human engineer looked up at the massive warrior without fear or concern, just the calm confidence of someone who had done his job well. The captain stopped in front of Wu and stared down at him for a long moment. The corridor fell silent, except for the steady hum of the now properly functioning engines. Everyone was waiting to see what the Korath leader would do then. Captain Moran did something that shocked everyone present. He knelt down so that his eyes were level with Wu's. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and respectful instead of the usual commanding growl. He asked how Wu had done it. How had a primitive human solved a problem that had stumped the greatest engineers in the Korath Empire? The quantum matrix was now running better than it had in years, and their instruments couldn't explain. Wu smiled and pulled the small resonance amplifier from his toolkit. He held it up so Captain Moran could see it clearly. The device was beautiful in its own way, a perfect example of Korath engineering that had been crafted with incredible precision, but he explained that the amplifier had been the problem all along. It was designed to improve efficiency by a tiny amount, but the harmonic vibrations it created were slowly destroying the quantum matrix. The effect was so subtle that it took years to show up, which was why the Korath engineers hadn't noticed it. The solution had been to replace the amplifier with something that would absorb vibrations instead of creating them. Wu pulled out his piece of shaped steel and showed it to the captain. The metal was simple and crude compared to Korath technology, but it was exactly what their engine needed. Captain Moran examined the steel with fascination. He could see that it had been crafted by hand with tools that were probably older than some of his crew members. The surface was polished to perfection and the shape was precise despite its primitive appearance. Next, Kala, the chief engineer, joined the conversation. She was still struggling to understand what had happened. Their most advanced diagnostic equipment hadn't been able to identify the root cause of the problem, but this old human had found it in a matter of hours. Wu explained that he had used techniques that were older than space travel itself. He had listened to the engine's heartbeat, felt the vibrations through the hull, and traced the energy flows with his hands. Instead of relying on instruments alone, the Korath engineers were amazed. They had been so focused on the complex quantum mechanics that they had forgotten about basic engineering principles. They had instruments that could measure things down to the subatomic level, but they hadn't noticed the simple vibration pattern that was destroying their ship. Commander Park watched the exchange with growing pride. She had known Wu for years and had always suspected that the other humans on the station were making a mistake by ignoring him. Now she was seeing proof that experience and wisdom were worth more than the latest technology. The test came when Captain Moran ordered his crew to prepare for departure. The Korath ship had been scheduled to leave days ago, but the engine problems had kept them trapped at the station. Now they would finally be able to complete their mission. The quantum matrix responded perfectly to the startup sequence. The energy flows were smooth and steady, and the power output was actually higher than normal. The piece of human steel was doing its job, absorbing the harmful vibrations that had been slowly killing the engine. But the real test came when they engaged the faster-than-light drive. The quantum matrix had to create a stable wormhole that would carry the massive ship across thousands of light years. Any instability in the matrix would cause the wormhole to collapse, possibly destroying the ship and everyone on it. Wu stood in the observation deck, watching through the reinforced windows as the Korath ship prepared to jump. The hull was glowing with energy, and space itself seemed to be bending around the vessel. The air crackled with power, and the station shook slightly from the gravitational effects. Then the ship disappeared in a flash of light that was brighter than a star. The wormhole opened and closed in less than a second, carrying the Korath vessel safely to its destination. The station sensors confirmed that the jump had been successful, and the ship was already thousands of light years away. The other aliens in the observation deck stood in stunned silence. They had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. An old human engineer had not only fixed advanced alien technology, but had actually improved its performance. The Lathi traders, who had always looked down on human engineering, were whispering among themselves about the implications. The Nix were humming in harmonies that expressed wonder and respect. Other species were starting to reconsider their assumptions about human capabilities. Word of the repair spread through the station faster than gossip in a small town. Within hours, everyone knew that the old human had accomplished something that the Korath engineers couldn't do. The story grew with each telling, until it sounded like a legend. Some people said that Wu had used ancient human technology that was more advanced than anything the aliens had. Some said he had special powers that let him understand machines better than anyone else. Others claimed that he had made a deal with mysterious forces, but the truth was simpler and more impressive than any legend. Wu had solved an impossible problem using nothing but experience, wisdom, and the basic principles of engineering. He had proven that sometimes the oldest solutions were the best ones. Commander Park found Wu back in his corner of the cantina, drinking coffee and looking like nothing special had happened. The other patrons were staring at him with new respect, but he seemed completely unaware of the attention. She sat down across from him and asked how he had known what to do when the greatest engineers in the galaxy were stumped. Wu smiled and said that every machine told a story. If you knew how to listen, he had learned to listen to machines when he was young, and that skill had only gotten better with age. The Korath had built something beautiful, but they had forgotten that engineering was about more than just advanced Technology sometimes the simplest solution was the best? One old engineer finished his coffee and stood up to leave. Another day was ending, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had found his purpose again. He was no longer just an old man taking up space in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. He was an engineer, and there would always be machines that needed fixing, problems that needed solving, and young people who needed to learn that wisdom came from experience, not from books. The news of Wu's miracle repair traveled through space faster than the fastest starship. Within 3 days, ships from dozens of different species were arriving at the remote station, all wanting to meet the legendary human engineer who had done the impossible. The first to arrive was a delegation of Velothi, traders who had always dismissed human technology as primitive and unreliable. Now they were practically begging for an audience with the old man who had solved a problem that stumped the mighty Korath Empire. Wu found himself in the strange position of being famous again, but this time it felt different. When he was young, the fame had been about what he might accomplish in the future. Now it was about what he had already proven he could do. The Velothi delegation was led by a female named Kira Vel, who wore robes that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She approached Wu with the careful respect usually reserved for dangerous predators or unstable explosives. She explained that the Velothi had been having problems with their own ships. Nothing as dramatic as the Korath crisis, but persistent issues that their best engineers couldn't solve. Their fusion cores were running less efficiently than they should, and their life support systems kept developing mysterious glitches. Wu listened politely as she described their problems. He could already see several possible solutions just from her basic description. The Velothi had fallen into the same trap as the Korath. They had made their systems so complex that they couldn't see the simple problems hiding in plain sight. But he surprised Kira Vel by refusing to work on their ships directly. Instead, he offered to teach their engineers how to look at problems differently, how to listen to what their machines were trying to tell them, how to find simple solutions to complex problems. The Velothi were confused by this approach. They had expected the legendary engineer to personally fix their ships using his mysterious human techniques. Instead, he wanted to share his knowledge with their own people. Wu explained that fixing their ships would only solve their immediate problems, but teaching their engineers would solve future problems. Before they happened, he was old and wouldn't be around forever, but the principles he could teach would last for generations more. Ships arrived every day bringing delegations from species that had never shown any interest in human engineering before. The crystalline Nyx sent a group of their finest technical specialists. The warrior Thrax arrived with a damaged battle cruiser that their own shipyards couldn't repair. Each group came expecting miracles, but Wu offered them something better. He offered them understanding. He showed them how to approach engineering problems with patience and creativity instead of just throwing advanced technology at everything. The Nyx were particularly fascinated by his methods. Their crystal bodies allowed them to interface directly with their technology, but they had become so dependent on this ability that they had lost the art of troubleshooting. When their direct interface failed, they were helpless. Wu taught them how to use simple diagnostic tools to understand what their machines were doing. He showed them how to trace problems back to their root causes. Instead of just fixing symptoms, the Nyx engineers were amazed by how much they could learn using basic instruments. The Thrax were more skeptical at first. Their whole culture was built around the idea that strength and advanced weapons were the only things that mattered. They couldn't understand why a week-old human would be better at engineering than their own warriors. But when Wu fixed their battle cruiser by replacing a single component with a piece of hand-forged metal, they began to see the value of his approach. The repair not only fixed their immediate problem, but made their entire propulsion system more reliable. Word of these successes spread even further, drawing attention from the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. The ethereal collective sent representatives who existed as pure energy and usually considered physical matter beneath their notice. Even they were impressed by Wu's ability to solve problems that their vast computational networks couldn't handle. The old engineer had something that all their advanced technology lacked: intuition and creativity. The station commander Park Hae watched this parade of visitors with amazement. She had always believed in Wu, but even she hadn't expected this level of response. The remote station was becoming a pilgrimage site for engineers from across the galaxy. The cantina, where Wu used to sit alone, was now always full of beings from dozens of different species, all hoping to learn from the master engineer. The old man had become the center of attention, but he handled it with the same quiet dignity he had shown when everyone ignored him young. Engineers from every species imaginable came to study with him. They brought their most difficult problems and their most advanced textbooks, but Wu taught them to put aside their preconceptions and learn to really see what was in front of them. He showed them that engineering wasn't about having the most advanced tools or the most complex theories. It was about understanding how things worked and finding creative ways to make them work better. The lessons he taught were simple but profound. Every machine had a purpose, and every problem had a solution if you looked at it from the right angle. The key was to stay curious and never assume that the obvious answer was the right one. Some of the young engineers were frustrated by his methods. They wanted quick fixes and easy answers, but Wu made them slow down and think. He taught them that the best engineers were not the ones who could memorize the most formulas, but the ones who could solve problems that had never been seen before. The transformation of the station was remarkable. What had once been a quiet backwater became a hub of innovation and learning. Engineers from across the galaxy came to study and ended up collaborating with each other, sharing knowledge and techniques. Old prejudices between species began to break down as they worked together on common problems. The Vilathi learned to appreciate the creativity of human engineering. The Nix discovered the value of Thrax durability testing. The Korath began to see that their technology could be improved by incorporating ideas from other species. At the center of it all was Wu, quietly teaching and guiding but never dominating. He encouraged his students to think for themselves and to find their own solutions to problems. He was proud when they succeeded, but never took credit for their achievements. The old engineer had found something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of purpose and the knowledge that his work mattered. He was no longer just fixing machines. He was building bridges between species and creating a new generation of engineers who would carry his teachings to the stars. Late at night, when the station was quiet and the last students had gone back to their ships, Wu would sit in his corner of the cantina and look out at the stars. He could see the lights of ships coming and going, bringing new problems and new opportunities. He thought about the accident that had driven him to this remote station and the years of guilt and loneliness that had followed, but now he could see that everything had led to this moment. All his experiences, good and bad, had prepared him to become the teacher that the galaxy needed. The old man smiled and finished his coffee. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new students eager to learn, but for now he was content to sit quietly and watch the stars, knowing that his greatest engineering project was not a ship or an engine, but the future itself. 6 months after the Korath incident, the remote station had become the most important engineering school in the galaxy. Ships arrived daily, bringing students from every corner of known space, all hoping to learn from the legendary master engineer. Wu had tried to discourage the title, but it had stuck. The young engineers who came to study with him spoke of him with reverence, usually reserved for religious figures or ancient heroes. They called him the bridge builder because he had shown them how to connect different technologies and different ways of thinking. The transformation of the station was complete. The old cantina had been expanded into a proper meeting hall where engineers from different species could work together on problems that had seemed impossible before. The repair bays were always busy with ships that had been brought from across the galaxy, but the most important changes were harder to see. The young engineers who studied with Wu went back to their homeworlds, carrying new ideas and new ways of approaching problems. They became teachers themselves, spreading his methods throughout their own civilizations. The Korath Empire had officially appointed Wu as their chief engineering consultant, a position that came with honors and riches beyond imagination, but the old man had politely declined the formal appointment. He preferred to remain on the station where he could teach anyone who wanted to learn. Captain Moran had returned several times, always bringing new problems for Wu to examine, but more often bringing young Korath engineers who needed to learn humility and creativity. The proud warrior had become one of Wu's most devoted supporters. The relationship between the species had changed in ways that went far beyond engineering. The Vellathi had stopped looking down on human technology and had begun incorporating human design principles into their own ships. The Nix had learned to value practical solutions over theoretical perfection even. The mysterious ethereal collective had sent representatives to study with Wu. These beings of pure energy had thought they were beyond the need for physical engineering, but they discovered that the principles Wu taught applied to their energy. Constructs as well. The old engineer had become something he never expected to be: a diplomat. His teaching methods required cooperation and mutual respect between different species. Young engineers who might have been enemies in their home systems worked together on the station as friends and colleagues, but perhaps the most significant change was in the way the galaxy viewed humanity. The humans had always been seen as newcomers who had barely learned to travel between stars. Now they were recognized as valuable contributors to galactic civilization. Other human engineers began arriving at the station, bringing their own knowledge and techniques. The galaxy discovered that humans had developed unique solutions to problems that other species hadn't even recognized. They had learned to make reliable technology from limited resources. Will welcomed his fellow humans, but he made sure they understood that the station was for everyone. The goal was not to prove that human engineering was superior, but to show that every species had something valuable to contribute. The old man had students from over 100 different species. Now each one brought their own perspective and their own challenges. Some were brilliant theorists who needed to learn practical skills. Others were skilled craftsmen who needed to understand the theory behind their work. One of his most promising students was a young Korath female named Zara Kim. She had arrived 6 months ago as an arrogant warrior who thought engineering was beneath her dignity. Now she was one of his most dedicated pupils, always eager to learn new techniques. Zara Kim had a natural talent for understanding machines, but more importantly, she had learned to listen to what they were trying to tell her. She could diagnose problems that other engineers missed and find solutions that were both elegant and practical. Another exceptional student was a Vellathi male named Jack Rowe, who had come to the station convinced that his people's advanced technology was perfect. He had learned that perfection was not the goal. Reliability and functionality were what mattered. The next student, called Deep Harmony, had been the most difficult to teach because her species communicated through vibrations in their crystal bodies, but she had learned to use simple tools and basic measurements to understand machines that her natural abilities couldn't interface with. Each success filled Wu with pride, but also with a growing sense of his own mortality. He was 75 now, and while he felt stronger than he had in years, he knew that his time was limited. He needed to make sure that his teachings would survive after he was gone. He began working on a comprehensive guide to engineering principles that any species could understand. It would not be a technical manual filled with equations and formulas, but a philosophy of how to approach problems with creativity and patience. The guide would include stories from his own experience and from the experiences of his students. It would show how the same basic principles applied to everything from simple mechanical devices to exotic quantum technologies. But more importantly, he was training a new generation of teachers, students who had mastered his methods and could pass them on to others. The knowledge would spread from teacher to student across the galaxy long after he was gone. The station had become more than a school. It had become a symbol of cooperation and shared knowledge. Species that had been enemies for centuries were working together on projects that benefited everyone. The old engineer often walked through the workshops and laboratories, watching his students work together on problems that challenged them all. A Thrax warrior might be working alongside a peaceful Nix philosopher, both focused on understanding the same complex system. These collaborations were producing innovations that no single species could have achieved alone. Ships were becoming more reliable and efficient. Transportation between worlds was becoming safer and faster. Communication systems were becoming more universal. The galaxy was becoming a more connected place, and Wu knew that his small contribution to this transformation was the most important work of his life. He had started as a young man trying to build better machines. Now he was an old man trying to build a better future. Late one evening, as he sat in his favorite corner of the cantina, Commander Parquet joined him. She looked tired but happy. The station had grown beyond anything she had imagined when she first suggested that the Korath consult with the old engineer. She asked him if he had ever imagined that fixing one alien ship would lead to all this. Wu smiled and said that engineering had always been about seeing possibilities that others missed. The Korath ship had been a problem that needed solving, but it had also been an opportunity, the opportunity to show that wisdom and experience were valuable, that creativity and intuition were just as important as advanced technology, that cooperation between different species could achieve more than any one civilization could accomplish alone. As they sat together watching the stars through the cantina windows, both of them could see the lights of ships coming and going. Some were bringing new students eager to learn. Others were carrying graduates back to their homeworlds, ready to share what they had discovered. The old engineer had become a legend, but not in the way he had been famous in his youth. This legend was based not on what he had built, but on what he had taught. He had shown the galaxy that the most important engineering project was not any single machine, but the future itself. Wu finished his coffee and stood up to leave. Another day was ending, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But he was no longer the lonely old man who had sat in this